phone on silent. Okay, fantastic. Good morning, everyone, and Shavua Tov. It's been a while since I had the pleasure of giving the shiur myself. I'm always accompanying. So today we're going to focus on, I think, one of the most practical subjects that is connected to Shabbat today. And our subject will be electricity on Shabbat. So basically, I think we could end this shiur in about 5 minutes, but just by saying, well, you can't use electricity on Shabbat. And if you have any questions about that, then you may have a problem because it's obviously not allowed. End of shiur. But what I would like to do today is take this as an opportunity to understand the development of halakha and also try to understand the importance of, and I'll begin with that before we get into electricity itself. At the end of last week's shiur, I made a comment to Rav Yoav, who's not here now to defend himself, so I can say what I want. But he said, Rav Yoav, at the end of the shiur, I made a point that with all of the different, I think the shiur for anyone who was not there was about hygiene and washing and different things. And I think the shiur kept going through, many things that were very limiting about the Shabbat. But the point that I made at the end of the shiur that I'd like to begin this shiur with is that it's very important to remember what the source is and whether we are talking about what level of prohibition we are talking about, and also whether it is done for the specific melacha as it was done originally, and whether it's done directly or unintentionally. Why did I make this point? And I think it's very important to begin with that. Because when you end up in certain situations, then we need to be able to remember whether something is d'oraita or d'Rabbanan. If something is from the Torah or it is from the sages. Why? No one will ever tell you that it's permissible to violate something that the sages taught us. So what does it matter if it's on a, why would it matter to me if it's from the Torah or it's from the sages, or whether it's d'oraita or d'Rabbanan? It's important to remember those terms, d'oraita and d'Rabbanan. Can anyone answer that? Why is it important? If we know that something is not allowed, why would it be important for me to know whether it is d'oraita or d'Rabbanan? Michael and Eva?
Yeah, I think it's important to know the source, because to understand where it came from and why. Because if it's from the Rabbanan, they will also explain why, and if it's from the Torah, we know it's so we know the source, because it's written in the Torah that you also should follow the rules of the Rabbanan. So it doesn't matter if to hold or not, but you should understand and know, I think.
It's a very good point that you just made. Thank you. In other words, in a sense, everything that the sages tell us is also from the Torah, because the Torah specifically says that according to the laws that the sages will give you, you must follow them as a directive from Hashem himself. So you are right in a sense, and it's also important to know the development also for rabbis, for example, to know how to further develop, such as the subject that we're going to talk about today. Electricity apparently did not exist at Mount Sinai, even though there was lightning and lights and thunder. Maybe I don't think it was a very good sound system that was in place. It was actual thunder. So in that sense, how do we interpret things and develop them for our understanding is very important. Any other ideas why it would be important? Tabitha, you have your hand up.
Yeah, because the things written in the Torah, it's higher level than the things from the Rabbanot. Like it's like one level up.
Okay, in what way? What does that mean? I agree. What does that mean? One level up?
I don't know how to explain it. That's just how I learned how it is.
Okay, so I'm gonna take your words one level up and explain a bit. This is sort of an introduction, because if I get myself into a certain situation, it's very important to know how I can solve it, and that solving will also depend on whether it is d'oraita or d'Rabbanan. In what way? For example, if I have someone who is sick at home, right? So there are things that are permissible to do for that person, which are d'Rabbanan, but not d'oraita. I can't grind, right, medicine and grind the actual root to make to make the medicine, because that is d'oraita. But medicine that is already prepared, taking that medicine would be d'Rabbanan, and therefore someone who needs it on Shabbat in order in this, so I can allow that type of thing. Another thing, for example, is if one, and this is very connected a lot to electricity. If we have a situation in which we are, in a synagogue. I was in Oslo. We had a Shabbat there. It was mentioned before in one of the shiurim, and with Rav Michael and Rav Yoav, and the electricity or the heating was not working. So there would be a difference in the way that we relate to lighting a fire in order to keep everyone warm, and turning on the electricity, because if it's the d'oraita, and then it's one level, like you were saying, and if it's the d'Rabbanan, then it's another level. So we're never going to say that we're actually permitting something because, it's not so serious because it's just the d'Rabbanan. But there are, in our understanding of what needs to be done when there's a certain need, if there's a baby, if there's a sick person, if people are cold, then of course we would prefer to find a way to do it d'Rabbanan than to do it, than to violate d'oraita. Another example might be if we need to do something and it's necessary, and we do it through speaking to a non-Jew or to hinting to a non-Jew. And we had that whole session about speaking to the non-Jew, where Rav Yoav basically said, well, it's not really okay. But in a situation in which it's really necessary, then if it was d'oraita, I'll give you an example. Driving someone in a car, right, might be different than pushing on the elevator button. Why? Because we're going to soon see that with electricity, there's different levels of understanding, even what the prohibition is. So only if everyone here understands that will I go forward. If anyone is going to use the shiur to then say, well, it's not so terrible, it's only d'Rabbanan, then I'm going to shut the shiur right now. So we're going to have full agreement and that everyone understands the point. Everyone with me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Good. I trust you. And it's important because we're not using this to break the words of our sages. What we're trying to do is understand. And now that we have that base for understanding, I'm going to go one step further. When we talk about electricity, it's a fascinating discussion, because it's something which is completely modern day, and it doesn't fit exactly to anything that we know is prohibited. In what way? The easiest way would be to say, well, you're lighting a fire. But then it also shows the importance of halakha and science and having a scientific understanding of technology, because you have to understand what is actually going on. Because what am I actually doing by turning on the light? What am I actually doing by using electricity? Is a question that our rabbis started asking themselves as soon as electricity was invented. And it's very fascinating to go through the responsa on this, because not so long ago, in Aruch HaShulchan, for example, which was in the 19th century, just the end of the 19th century, he says, well, this is a philosophical discussion because not so many people really are using electricity. So imagine the difference between that and nowadays, when we have ongoing questions which even make it very difficult to follow the Shabbat. And we can talk about those at the end of the shiur, because we keep hearing questions. What do I do about this light that gets turned on every time I get near the building? What do I do if I need a card to get in to my apartment, and different things like that. So it's getting more and more difficult as the world becomes more dependent on electricity. So just to begin with the notion, let's take it to its farthest extreme. And let's say that electricity, or let's say that someone invented electricity that had nothing to do with fire anymore. Okay, for example, LED lights today are not really electricity in the same way, right? They're not wires inside lighting up a bulb as the old light bulbs used to look. So you see that you're getting further and further away from what we would consider fire. So I want to start at that end of the spectrum, and it would be obvious to everyone that if we were to find ways to allow electricity, it would destroy the whole idea of Shabbat. Because I think everyone here understands the blessing of not using electricity and not using the computer and not using the phone for a complete 24, 25 hours. It's one of the greatest blessings that we have. And what if we were to figure out ways to do that? Well, I'll give you another example at that end of the spectrum before we take it all the way back to the other end. What happens if I have a TV that is on? It's just on, right? My TV, I left it on just before I lit Shabbat candles, and then I sat down to my favorite evening program. So again, the people running the TV, especially not if we talk about Israel, it would be a different case because it might be a Jewish person. And then that person is violating the Shabbat for me in a sense. But let's say in the Nordic countries, I have a great evening program. I don't want to miss it. It's Friday evening, the Friday evening comedy show in Norway or in Denmark, and I really don't want to miss it. It's gonna really make my oneg Shabbat, give me pleasure on the Shabbat. What would be the problem to do that? I'm not actually doing anything. And what's the difference between that and leaving a plata on, which is also using electricity? Any ideas? What's the difference between between the two of them? Anyone want to, Michael, I'm not shouting you, but anyone else want to share with us today? What's the difference? In what way, just in your own minds, what would be allowed regarding electricity and what would be not? Good, thank you. We have a couple of other hands, so let's go through. Rebecca, please.
Initially, I'm thinking about the spirit of Shabbat. So it's not the spirit of Shabbat to watch television, but having a meal is a part of Shabbat. So then it would make sense to have a plata. That's my initial thought.
Okay, thank you. So the spirit, just to follow up on what you're saying, how do I define that spirit? It's a bit vague. What things would I allow and what would I not allow? Can I have the electric light on in my fish aquarium? Is that spirit or is that not spirit?
But if the light has already been on before Shabbat, then it doesn't really make any sense to turn it off. I mean, you could just keep going.
I'm asking, it's an open question because the TV is also just running. My radio is just running. My alarm clock is just running. I can have, that's what electricity allows me to have things just running in the ways that it wasn't the same. We'll see, but we'll see that in a certain way, it's similar if you had something on the fire before Shabbat and it keeps cooking. But here we're talking about, as you're saying, the spirit of things. So where do I define what is and what is not allowed? For example, I'll give you an example. Can I, we'll get to this later, but can I have my dishwasher on a timer? Is that in the spirit of Shabbat to have a machine running, or is it clearly not? Rebecca, what do you think?
I personally don't think it is. I mean, you can put it on after Shabbat. But then again, like depends. I mean, I don't think I would use a dishwasher. I would probably wash plates by hand if I needed them during Shabbat. I guess what I'm trying to, the way that I'm trying to interpret it is using electricity when it's necessary. If it's not necessary, then it can wait. Watching television is probably not necessary. Running the dishwasher is probably not necessary. It's stuff that can wait after Shabbat.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your input. Let's get some more reflections or ideas, and then we'll try to put them together. Daniel.
Yes, I'm thinking about the spirit also, or commenting on the spirit of Shabbat, that the day should be, it should differ from the other days. So if we are having a TV on the other days, we don't, the Shabbat, they won't differ. And so that makes a difference between the TV and the other. You had another example of electricity, I think, and also, yeah, for the fish, I'm thinking we should not maybe affect others in a negative way because of us having Shabbat, so the fish could have his light, maybe.
Okay. You want the fish to have the pleasure of their light on the Shabbat as well. Yeah, but maybe they should be in the dark so they don't see you eating the gefilte fish, right? Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, Elisa and Victor, please.
Could it be so that from the TV there can come some show that would ruin the mood of Shabbat? In order to prevent this from happening, it's better to have the TV closed.
Yes. So, so just to gather your thoughts, which I think, and I took it all the way to the extreme because, as I said, we're going to go back. But at the extreme level is, what if I am not doing anything? Electricity really allows a completely to destroy the environment that we're trying to create on the Shabbat. In certain ways, because we can say, I am not doing anything, right? I'm actually, someone else is doing it. But I think we all have a sense that if any one of us who's been at a Shabbat table in a proper right home with a Shabbat setting, or we have it in our own homes, then we intuitively feel this is not right. And in that sense, what we're talking about is not, even before we talk about electricity, we're going to talk about something which is connected to the rest on the Shabbat. And I'm going to share a source with you. Let me try. Here we go. So we have something called Shvut. Shvut means to have, I think it's in a way what you're calling spirit, but Shvut actually means to stop the normal life, right? To stop what is considered normal. So if we just look at the sources here, so we have the pasuk that is upcoming next week in the Torah reading, that we say 6 days one shall do work, and on the 7th day one shall rest. And that rest includes the animals, in order that the animals, the ox and the donkey shall rest, and also your maids and the strangers, or the gerim here means those who are outsiders in a sense. So what we see here is that there's a general, that even the rest on the Shabbat itself that the pasuk talks about is not only talking about what you are doing, but that even if your animal is to plow the field by itself, that is not okay. The animal must rest on the Shabbat. You're also not allowed to benefit from work that is being done on the Shabbat itself, during the Shabbat. So even if someone else was to be doing something on the Shabbat, we can't benefit from it if it was done for our sake. For example, if someone were to cook up, I'm at a neighbor's, the person is not Jewish, and they say, oh, let me put up a cup of tea. They go and they turn on the kettle and they pour a cup of tea for you, thereby cooking the tea for you on the Shabbat. That is not permissible, because that is a melacha that is being done for you, but also this idea that everything surrounding is an idea of shvut, that we have this idea of the spirit of the Shabbat, of creating an environment in which melachot are non-existent. And let's look at the midrash on this. It says in the pasuk, "Ushmartem et hayom hazeh lidorotechem." You shall keep this day for your generations. And the midrash asks, but we already know that the pasuk tells us we're not supposed to do the melacha. It already says, "Kol melacha lo yaseh behem." So why do I have to stress again, you shall keep these days for your generations? So it teaches us, "Eni ele dvarim shehem mishum melacha." When the Torah tells us we shall not do melacha, then I know it's strictly melacha that I'm not allowed to do. But what about those things that are not direct melachot? Any ele dvarim shehem mishum melacha, dvarim shehem mishum shvut minayin. Where do I know that those that are considered shvut, that are violating the rest of the Shabbat? Therefore, the Torah tells us, "Ushmartem et hayom hazeh lahavi dvarim shehem mishum shvat." So how about activities which can be regarded only as detracting from the restfulness of the day? This is shvut. The scripture therefore says, "Therefore you shall observe this day," thus prohibiting even such work as only detracts from the restfulness of the day. So the midrash comes and teaches us that we have something which is called shvut. Shvut means that even things that are not directly fitting into I am now violating a melacha, but things that are violating this idea of restfulness are not allowed. This opens up a huge discussion of what is shvut, because we can, even in this room, as we heard, we have different opinions. I think everyone here basically agrees, but maybe someone would say, well, that TV show is actually exactly what it's giving me, what I need in the Shabbat. Or let's take a better example, maybe a more complex example, right? What if we had classical music on, soft classical music on in the background, and I come and sit down to my Shabbat meal and I'm listening to a waltz, and then I get up with my wife and I start singing Eshet Chayil to Johann Strauss, and it's a beautiful romantic moment, right? Okay, so it can be more complex than that, than just what do I feel, what does someone else feel. Yes, Silke, and then Lars.
I guess I would also be a little bit, I can't remember the word for it, but it's also about tradition. So there's two elements to it. If this is not the tradition to do it here, because apparently I think Johan said at one time people were watching television and then it stopped. I also would be a little bit careful not to, let's say somebody else was if I'm hosting a Shabbos dinner, then I don't want somebody to think that this is okay. So if they come to my house and I'm having music on, even if it was on before they came, then I don't want to signal that this is okay, because I know it's not okay, and I know at least it's not the tradition. Of course, I would also know it was against 39 melachot, but I wouldn't signal that this was an okay behavior in Shabbat.
Yes, thank you. One of the things that you mentioned is something we call mar'it ayin, the way that people look at things. In other words, even if I know myself that something would be okay, or I found a way around it, I found a solution, right? And I found a way that I'm actually not violating something, but someone else doesn't know that. And they might come to do the actual melacha itself because they don't know. They're not knowledgeable. And what does it look like? So in this case, and I'll just add before we listen to you, Lars, I'll add that it's very important what is norm and what is not. For example, if there was a country that no one uses a plata on Shabbat, it's unknown, right? No one uses the hot plate on the Shabbat. Then it might be problematic for me to import one and start using it because they don't know, and they might come to think that that is okay. I'll give you, I'll tell you an actual story that I heard just to emphasize this point. There was a custom that not so long ago in Istanbul, in Turkey, in which in one of the synagogues there, the people would go on the last day of Pesach, okay, and they would following the Musaf service, everyone would go out and buy a piece of bread, no less, from the local bakery on Pesach, go around to the corner, sit behind the wall and have a piece of bread. And someone came there after a few years and was shocked and was trying to understand how could such a thing happen? It's obvious, it's bread on Pesach. But if you remember, the Chagim in Israel are one day less than the Chagim, right, in the diaspora. There's one day instead of 2 last days of Pesach, 7th and 8th, there's only the 7th day. So apparently there was a rabbi who came, and or maybe it wasn't a rabbi because I don't think it's so okay to do such a thing, but there was someone who came from Israel, and he said, well, it's no longer Pesach for me, but I can't have them see me eat chametz. So he went to the local bakery and he bought a small pita, and he made sure to walk around to the side of the wall to see that, so that no one would see him violating the Pesach, so they wouldn't get this idea in their mind. But you see that became a tradition, that they thought they were doing everything wrong all of these years because this person had come from the Holy Land, and this is what he was doing. So it's an actual story which shows us that that it's not a question, I'm not faking something by not showing it. As you say, Silke, we should be very careful about the messaging that we give over. And that again, today everyone knows that we have something called the Shabbat timer that can turn on lights, that can turn off lights, that can turn the plata on, that can turn the plata off. So since we have that as a norm, then that is something that everyone will see. If they're starting to keep Shabbat, then they'll see that in every home. And that's why it's also important to have a hot plate, for example, to keep yourself within those norms. However, if I come up with an invention of a way of bypassing a melacha, in which is completely permissible, or for example, putting on classical music just before Shabbat starts. As you say, first of all, it's not, this is not, we might like it, but it's not the mood of Shabbat. It may very well be Shavut, but also that Mar'it Ayin is very important as well, the way others might see it. And I never know who's watching, not because I'm hiding something, but because people learn from the smallest things that we do. Lars, you've had your hand up. It's so tired now. You can take it down.
Okay. Yes. When I pray in the morning, I used to start with in weekdays with have a little music and sing with, for example, Adon Olam, to come in because I'm praying alone. So I wondered, I thought about, would it be a way to actually have some support during the Shabbat to when I'm alone, or just one other unlearned person, maybe to have some support for the Shabbat songs. And I thought about this, and I thought about it, if it was maybe a possibility to do the same with the Shabbat lamp, to have something that some soundproof box or something that you put over the speaker or something. And the first problem was this: with you cannot have like instruments, because it's not. So others could think it's okay with the instrument. So I thought about, would it be possible to have just singing, just voices, because that's not forbidden. So but I never came to any other solution or result that it felt very much not in the spirit of Shabbat to have this construction or bypass thing. So that was my finding, but I didn't find actually that it would be totally forbidden to maybe have something in the beginning that would not like turn on or off, that gave out from a loudspeaker singing as a support to Shalom Aleichem or something like that, and then disappeared. But it didn't feel right.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna comment on that, but let's hear Monica and Katov, please.
Yeah, this is, I understand if you don't have the answer to this, because this is actually about the situation that we are in Europe because of the war in Ukraine. And last year, people were asked to save electricity. So if you have a timer for Shabbat, then your light will go on even if you don't need it. And you're not saving anything. You're not contributing to what the government had asked you to do for other people. And when you know that some places in Europe, people have to choose if they should warm their dinner or if they should have their light on, because the electricity is so expensive, it's a little bit difficult not to turn off the light and turn off everything when you can turn it off, and only turn it on when you actually need it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rebecca.
I don't know if it's kind of like an odd question, but I don't know how you would answer someone in this situation. Like, for instance, I know people who use Shabbat timers on their television. Some people do this and perhaps make the argument that whatever they are watching is something they wouldn't watch in a normal weekday. So, for instance, if you have a busy schedule, you wouldn't normally watch television, and television is something you can only watch when you're resting. So I'm just wondering, like, what's kind of the rabbinical view on this? It's not me, by the way. I've heard this as something people do.
So I'm going to actually take this example from you in order to reflect on what Lars was saying before. I think that we understand even before looking at the melachot themselves, because I've taken it to the end of the spectrum to say what is actually wrong here, but I want to talk about the melachot themselves as well. But just to reflect on this, since electricity is so essential and such a part of our lives, including communication, including social media, including television, it's quite a slippery slide that very fast we can end up without any Shabbat at all. I think we cannot imagine how fast things can change. And just walk into any neighborhood in an Orthodox community, in a Jewish community, be it in Europe and Israel, and feel the gift of that silence and realize that this is actually something very special. And that trying to find ways around, this is not, I'm not talking about the electricity question. about the light, but finding ways around so that I can do this or that, it's a very slippery slide. And I can actually find ways around it because, as we said, okay, I'm not doing it. It's being done by itself. It's someone else who's doing it. It can be a recording, etc., etc. And okay, but that's why I wanted to start at this extreme. That I think we should define for ourselves what are the needs of electricity that are actually necessary, and anything else should not be allowed. Why is that? Because otherwise we're going to end up in a very, I think everyone's going to decide for themselves what I can do, and it's not a milacha, and this is not really shvut because I'm really resting, as you just said. And what is allowed in terms of electricity are specific needs that have to do with providing me what I need on the Shabbat. And already back in the Talmud talks about specific needs that are connected to two things, to heating and to light. That's it, and to food, right? So you have heating as in warmth, you have, and the question back then was, for example, can you have a fire and keep the fire going? And then the question that, or the problem with the fire going is that there's a tendency to keep adding or to play around with it or to blow into it. But as long as you prevent that, then it's allowed. Why? Because that warmth is necessary on the Shabbat, as is hot food is the oneg of the Shabbat, is the pleasure of Shabbat. So as long as I'm preventing myself from doing, from blowing into a fire, which is prevented by electricity, for example, because there's no fire to blow, then that would be allowed. However, if I have an oven that is on and my food is already cooked, but it has knobs, then it would also be problematic because I can find myself unintentionally playing around. Oh, the cake is burning now. And then I immediately, we all know how that is in the kitchen. The moment of that, overcook, then we just don't even think and we react. So that would be a difference between, that is why a plata is allowed, a hot plate, because it's completely covered. There's no knobs or anything. So it's following that directive from the Talmud. So if we limit things to what is allowed, what is necessary, then we can say electricity, heating, and cooking of food or warming of food. These are the basic elements. Anything else which is adding to an environment can actually detract from it and actually end up ruining the Shabbat, that we have no Shabbat, which is left for us, any sense of that Shabbat. This, I would say, is a big difference between the rabbinical Orthodox world and where things broke off from there into the conservative and the reform world, because that's exactly these things where they said, well, we're still following the basic halachic principle, but we will change that. And then the next step was to say, well, if someone needs to drive on Shabbat to shul and otherwise he won't come, then he can drive. And again, you just go from there to actually violating actual milachot, and that's not how it started. That's not how the discussion started about this. So you see how fast that can change. Regarding the Shabbat timer and electricity, I think the Shabbat timer can actually help conserve. The fact that we have one can help us conserve electricity throughout the week. And maybe in the current situation, it requires better planning to know when it is that I actually need the light. The timer can also be set at very small intervals of a quarter of an hour. So you can turn it on, and we'll talk about it later, that maybe if necessary, you can even extend a certain situation. I'll get to that at the end of the shiur. So maybe that's a solution for the current situation that we are in, but let's get to there. Daniel? We can't hear you.
I had a point, but
are you allowed to pull off the timer's knob? For example, if you have estimated 2 hours for keeping the hot platter on, but you have finished it before before within 1 hour, and 1 hour it will keep on going 1 hour more. So are you allowed to take off the knob before it start to lift up the knobs from the timer, so you can save 1 hour more energy?
Okay, yes. So let's get to the Shabbat timer at the end. Let's leave that. I'll get to that question at the end of the shiur. Okay.
Thank you.
But I took us to the opposite extreme to say what is actually problematic if there were no problems. But now I'm going to take it back to the beginning. And the most simple milacha, if we look at the milachot of Shabbat, what would that be regarding electricity? You don't remember the 40 minus 1 milachot by heart?
You mean that it's not, it's forbidden?
What would be forbidden? Why would it be forbidden?
Because it's like fire. It's like and that's creating something. Or
yeah, so even if you're not turning the fire on yourself, we have something called mav'ir. Mav'ir is to light or to strengthen fire itself. So if we look at the Maimonides, for example, so he gives another example, which is very close to electricity in the way, according to some of the opinions. And he says a person who melts even the slightest amount of metal or heats a piece of metal until it glows like a coal performs a derivative of the forbidden labor of cooking. Similarly, a person who melts wax, tallow, tar, brown tar, or pitch, and the like performs a derivative of cooking and is liable. Similarly, a person who heats an earthenware utensil until it becomes hard clay is liable for cooking. The general principle is whether one softens a firm entity with fire or hardens a soft entity, one is liable for cooking. So in other words, in one way, we could say that we have it connected to the melacha of lighting a fire, and connected to that also we have the idea of cooking. The question that has been risen is this actually cooking? Because when we're talking about a fire during the time of the Talmud of Maimonides, then we're talking about actual lighting a fire, and in that sense, like he's saying, either for your utensil or for cooking. Here we're actually not lighting a fire. All we're doing is turning on a light or turning on, right? Electricity is very far away from that. When we began the discussion regarding electricity within the rabbinical responsa, there were those who came forward and said, yes, it is actually what we would say is that it's closest to this idea of fire. But we actually have another idea, which some of the rabbinical opinions connected to, which is called molid. And it's actually, molid is to give something, to create something that did not exist before. And I just want to get through some of these sources before, because we've taken a while. So we talked about here bishul, which is connected to cooking, which we saw in Maimonides. Another, and I'm just going to go through this very quick. Another idea is that's connected to molid. If we look at the Mishnah in Beitzah, it says as follows: one may not produce fire either from wood or from stones or from earth or from tiles or from water, nor may one make tiles red hot in order to roast on them. Why? Because he is creating something new on a festival. The idea of creating something new is originally at the beginning of this Talmudic tractate. The idea of something new is actually connected, for example, to cooking an egg on a festival. Why? Because I'm allowed to cook on a chag as long as I'm not lighting the light, right? I can transfer fire. So am I allowed to go out to the chicken coop and pick up an egg, a fresh egg from the morning, bring it inside and cook it? So actually, according to the milachot, there's no problem with the cooking itself. but the Talmud adds that there's something which is called molid or molad. What does it mean, leholid? Holada means I'm creating something new. The spiritual idea behind this is that everything that that I use on the Shabbat should exist the moment that I light the candles of the Shabbat or the Yom Tov, right? In other words, that the space or the dimension of the Shabbat itself is connected to that I have everything there at that moment, because that also allows the restfulness. I'm not creating something new. We talked about this when we talked about Eruv and walking more than 2 kilometers, having my space, my dimension on the Shabbat. In that same way, I don't create something new. Creativity is not only in terms of making art, which might be connected to weaving, it's connected to be writing, all of those milachot that are directly connected to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle. But there's also this idea, even if none of that were true, I would still be creating something new. For some of the rabbinical contemporary rabbis who discussed the idea of electricity, especially a famous one of the famous one, we have this discussion already back to Rav Kook's time about whether it is cooking or whether we have this idea of creating something new. Electricity is actually directly connected to creating something new. That's what it's doing, right? It's bringing and allowing something into my life that wasn't there. It's from the outside. We can connect that to the question about the TV as well, right? This is not the space. Why do I feel that it's not right? Because I have what I need on the Shabbat, and then suddenly something from the outside is coming in. I just like to go through, because we're short on time. I see that there's some more questions, but I just want to go through some of the ideas that are connecting the problems of the Shabbat. So we have this idea of cooking. We have this idea of molid. Then we have the Chazon Ish, a very famous rabbi, who came up with an idea, and he says it's actually more than anything else, the problem with electricity is connected to building. Because what you're doing by shutting the socket or opening a socket is actually construction, because you're creating and enclosing a circuit that was not existent before. So he says, even if it has nothing to do with the fire, what it's connected to what we're talking about of this idea of to create something new, but he's saying you're actually constructing by doing so. So he is saying that just through that fact that you are closing the circuit or opening the circuit, it has to do, is connected to construction, and therefore it would be, in that case, we would consider it a melacha deoraita if it was considered actual building. So we see here that I'm just gonna, because we're short on time, I'm gonna skip down to the final one, which is we saw cooking, we saw creating something new, we saw the idea of construction, and the final one is maybe for some of us makes much the most sense. If we look at Maimonides in Hilchot Shabbat, he says as follows: a person who kindles even the smallest fire is liable, provided he needs the ash that it creates. However, should a person kindle a fire with a destructive intent, he is not liable, for he is causing ruin. Nevertheless, a person who sets fire to a heap of produce or a dwelling belonging to a colleague is liable, because his intent is to take revenge on his enemies. So that's a separate case. Similarly, a person who lights a candle or wood, whether to generate warmth or light, is liable. A person who heats iron in order to strengthen it by submerging it in water is liable for performing a derivative of the forbidden labor of kindling. So before, the Rambam was talking specifically about cooking and connecting it to cooking, and here he's talking about something which is much closer to what we're talking about, which is kindling. So if I'm losing you, or we had a few hands up. I'm just gonna go through 4 ideas that we that we brought forward very quickly. First of all, the idea of cooking itself is problematic. The idea of kindling anything is problematic. And even if you say electricity is not either of those, then we have an opinion that it's connected to creating something new, and another idea that it's construction. We had 2 hands up, both Rebecca and Lars. Lars, please.
Yes, well, the thing with creating something new, is that connected to, it must be in some way connected to that Hashem created things in 6 days and then rested on 1 day, and that the Shabbat is in some way to rest together with Hashem. And then it's like a basic thought that what is actually needed to be done to not create, but to rest and to be spiritually together with Hashem in that kind of special moment. Is that or is it is it more the tabernacle, and is it based on resting together with Hashem? That's my question.
Both of those are actually connected directly. The Torah connects the 2 of them and says the reason that we don't do the melacha is because Hashem did not do any melachot, and that he rested, vayinafash, as we say in the Kiddush, right? That he rested, and nefesh is the soul. He gave a place for the soul, so that our connection on Shabbat is connected to spiritual things, to the soul. Then, on the other hand, where do we derive what is our understanding of melacha? It's from the Mishkan of what are those 40 minus 1 melachot, the 39 melachot. So those 2 are connected exactly as you're saying, in the sense of saying that what exists when I light the Shabbat candles is what I have for the rest of the day. And everything has to be set in place at that moment. And that also allows an internal rest, because I'm not dealing with filtering out content as I do the whole week. I'm not dealing with thinking about something coming from the outside. I'm welcoming, I have my home space, I have the synagogue, I have a place for my spiritual home, and I have my guests within that space. And that is what the Shabbat should look like. So in that sense, as we said before, we're going to limit anything that can enhance that through the specific necessities, as long as they are set before Shabbat, is okay. Rebecca.
I was just a bit curious about the last thing you read, which is basically you're allowed to ruin something. Does that mean that you could technically turn off a light on Shabbat? So
the melacha of turning off, and we'll get to the Shabbat timer in a second. Shabbat turning off is the opposite of any of these melachot, but it's also connected to michabe. Michabe is to extinguish the flame. To extinguish the flame is also a melacha in and of itself, because that's what was done in the Mishkan. They would light the wood, actually not for the sense of lighting, but in order to use the ashes. That's what the Maimonides was referring to. So in that sense, it's even more, in some ways, it's more problematic to turn off than it is to turn on. I'm not saying it's okay to turn on. I'm saying it's more directly related to the melacha itself when we're talking about turning off. So what we saw is that we saw 4 different ways of looking at electricity as connected to different aspects. However, okay, it's not so clear that there's a direct correlation between them and electricity as it is today. And electricity today is getting further and further away from actually doing something, because you can now walk into a house and say, and talk to your system, and the system will do everything for you. You can use a remote control on your air conditioner. What are you actually doing there, right, is a question. So some of our the opinions today will see electricity as the oraita for the reasons that we've mentioned, for one of the reasons that we said, whether it's construction, whether it's kindling a light. Other of the biggest rabbis of the last generation have come forward and saying it's not really d'oraita, it's d'Rabbanan. And many will follow those opinions. This was the greatest rabbi of response of halacha, Reb Zalman Auerbach, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, for example, in Jerusalem. He put together a response in which he went through all of these different opinions, and in the end he says, well, it's actually, according to my opinion, it's really not d'oraita, it is d'Rabbanan. The reason that that is helpful is not that it allows us or permits us to do anything on the Shabbat, but if that is the basis for our understanding, then as we said, in a place of need, in which someone, for example, is sick, in which something needs to be done, if you have a need to say something to a non-Jew, so for example, if my lights go off on the Shabbat and it's completely unbearable and I cannot live in that situation, then maybe I can go somewhere else. But if I actually need that, my refrigerator loses the electricity. You know, the electricity goes off in the apartment, and I'm going to lose all of my meat that I ordered last week from Kosher for You. This is not an advertisement for them. You know, I'm going to lose, and I'm not going to have kosher meat to eat for the next month, and it's a huge loss. So in such a case, it would be very important to realize, okay, well, maybe in that case, I could go and find a neighbor who, because it is the Rabbanan and it is not d'oraita, but of course, since this is such a complex thing, it's very good that all of you have your rabbis to ask and to run to in case of need on the Shabbat. And it's something that happens regularly. Even with knowledgeable people. Just 2 weeks ago, someone came to me with a question. It was Shabbat evening, it was after the Tefillah, and they came to me with a similar question in Shul. In Israel, where people are knowledgeable and people know, still it's a regular thing that since it's so complex, you go and ask the rabbi what to do in that case, and he will have to evaluate the situation according to the different response that has been given and according to the situation. So just to sum up before we get to the Shabbat timer and a few other things. To sum up, we've seen different opinions. According to some of them, electricity would be d'oraita. According to others, it would be d'Rabbanan. Anyway, it is for sure not permissible. We talked about the idea of Shvut, that Shabbat is a day of rest. We talked about the fact that everything should be set before Shabbat begins and not having external interference into the Shabbat itself, which can very easily come through electricity. And we said that in case of need, it may be permissible to accept that it is d'Rabbanan and not d'oraita, and that one could ask based on that whether something very urgent could be done on the Shabbat in such a case. Before we have two hands raised, but I want to get to one more point before we take those questions. A general rule that one other thing that we have not mentioned is that machinery is not allowed to run on the Shabbat. Machinery being that, which also can connect to the idea of the TV running. Machines should not run on the Shabbat. This goes back to the Talmud already discusses if you have a mill which is running, for example, you have other things which are running from before the Shabbat. There's a discussion, and there's something which is noise, creating a noise on the Shabbat. A machine running is not something which is okay. Therefore, in general, machines should not be running. Laundry should be for sure finished before the end of the Shabbat. You can't have your laundry machine running after the Shabbat begins, right? it's not only a question of environment, it's actually problematic in terms of halakha. It's not only, oh, how did I light the Shabbat candles, right? It's running, it creates that noise in the background. It's not okay. Regarding the dishwasher, in most houses, no one would use a dishwasher on the Shabbat. Lately, there are dishwashers which are very, very silent and not even noticeable, but then, and you can put a timer on them in advance. You might find some people who completely keep halakha and Shabbat, and they use the washing machine they've received from, the rabbi has told them that it's okay. But again, as we said before, we're not going to be doing things that are not accepted in our communities. So make sure to ask your rabbi before you do such a thing. I'm just saying, if you're shocked and you end up in a house and you see someone running the machine, then that could be permitted. It's, as I said, most people will not permit it for obvious reasons. If you have the water boiler that is on a timer, you talked about that last week, that would be problematic as well for different reasons. But the very fact that the water is boiling on the Shabbat and then you're using the boiling water would be a problem of cooking on the Shabbat. You talked about that last week. But we have the water heater, which is on, and if it's on a setting that it's not recooking itself all of the time and it's on, then because it's such an important thing to be able to have a hot cup of tea or coffee on the Shabbat, this was done for centuries now, even before electricity, in which they had a hot kettle on, especially in Europe in the cold winters. It was a known thing that they would have a hot kettle even on the fire. Not directly on the fire, we won't get into that, but that the kettle, that this type of Shabbat urn that you can buy, it's better if you buy one that has been checked halachically. You can get it easily online today. But if you don't, if you have something which does not turn, which is on a set temperature, that after it's already boiled and you don't have that reboiling all the time, then it would be okay. Regarding the Shabbat timer, I'll just get back to our question on that. As we said, there's a difference between extinguishing and turning on. The Shabbat timer is already set. And according to some opinions, since it is already, you're not doing anything direct, you're doing something indirect. And if it is necessary for Shabbat, it could be allowed to extend that position that it is in. For example, I didn't know that there was a Kiddush at Shul, and I set my timer for the Plata from 10 to 12 to put my dry food on in the morning, right? And then I come back and I'm like, oh no, I'm not going to have warm food for the Shabbat meal because I didn't know there would be a long Kiddush and a Bet Midrash following that. So now, so in such a case, it would be permitted to extend very carefully the current situation, to extend it for this specific purpose. Okay, if I have light on and the light is about to go off and I really want to learn Torah and I want to prepare the lesson for tomorrow, for the morning. So in many cases, it would be, according to many opinions, it would be allowed to extend the Shabbat time. But first of all, I can tell you that many times you might find yourself turning it off by mistake. So it's really not a good idea to start playing around with that on Shabbat unless you really need to. And secondly, we can extend, but we can't take it back, because if we're detracting, then it's closer to extinguishing. We're making it extinguish earlier than extending the current situation. I'm giving you a general agreement, but you might hear other opinions or read other opinions on this as well. So in that case, it would be better to have it a shorter amount of time. And going back to the electricity and the crisis now with the Ukraine, so you can set your timer for a shorter amount of time. You can even set it at a quarter-hour interval, have it on for a quarter hour, half an hour, and then if you need it more, then you could add another quarter hour. Accordingly, I would get a big timer so that it's not one of these small ones that you're trying with a toothpick to try to get into there. That you get a bigger one, that it's easier, so that it's quite, but again, before you do that, you can quote me on this, that's not a problem, but you should ask your rabbi what is accepted, because there are different opinions. And again, what we did, we limited the use of electricity when necessary for specific cases. If someone is sick, if it's an older person, regarding babies, if they need heat or anything like that, then for sure that would be one side of the that we spoke about. But anything else is directly connected to Oneg Shabbat, not to the TV, not to pleasure, not to radio, not to music, but to the light and the cooking that is creating, that is part of the Shabbat atmosphere that I already have. We have 2 questions here, and anyone else, if anything was unclear as well. Dan, please. Dan, you had a question? Okay, we'll go back to Elisa and Victor.
All right, so the question is that if I have automated systems, then it's okay to run it on Shabbat, because they are already pre-scheduled and they are automated, so I don't really need to do anything to interfere with it.
Yes, so if we have an automated system that is connected to the lighting, it's actually good, it conserves electricity, and I'm not doing anything. I have one in my house. Many people will do so for Shabbat. So it's a good system. Anything else which changes, which would be, I don't know if it was music or anything else, would be problematic. One other thing that you're reminding me we didn't mention is that the problem of I cannot cause the electricity to go on. So all of these things regarding sensors, for example, become a huge problem, because by stepping into the sensor, I'm making the movement. If my automated system is depending on my sensor of me walking into the home, then it would be problematic. And if it's an automated system that it doesn't matter, then no. But if I'm walking by a building and the sensor turns the light on, the staircase on, all of that, these are complicated issues to solve, because it is problematic. Monica
How
and Kato.
to then
Yes.
how to then like go on with the problem? Because in many staircases they have sensors that check that if somebody's walking in the staircase, so they put the lights on automatically. So how to then avoid it?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more of a problem, especially in Northern Europe, where it's becoming normalized. And there's no good solution, because we can't allow, you're actually you're benefiting from the fact that the light goes on. If we were not benefiting from that, maybe it would be easier, but we actually are benefiting from that. One solution would be to wait for someone else to walk down the stairs, so that they are putting it on for themselves, and then to walk down with them. We didn't discuss, for example, elevators, right? What if someone were to walk into an elevator and put it on for themselves and go to the floor that they wanted? We're talking about a non-Jewish person, of course. Maybe that could be allowed, but again, doesn't fit the environment. But if someone were older and really needs it, so in Israel, you have implemented systems of something called the Shabbat elevator. Shabbat elevator is not, it should be only when it's really necessary. Because again, we talk about shvut, we talk about the idea of restfulness on Shabbat, and you're using electricity in that sense. So these systems have been put in. For example, a Shabbat elevator means it's like an automated system that it goes from floor to floor by itself, and you're not actually doing anything. So these were created in order to, well, if you're living on the 30th floor of a building and how you're not going to go to the synagogue, then you created these systems. But it's mostly for elderly people. There's fantastic, there's a whole halachic science, almost like university in Israel, that is creating solutions, especially for older people, handicapped people, people that need to use wheelchairs, so that they're not doing any direct melacha on the Shabbat. But for us, if we're not in a situation that we need, then it's better not to. If someone else is doing it for themselves, then we can use it. When I was in Oslo for that freezing Shabbat, then Rabbi Yoav put me up in a hotel. I was there just Thursday, and I called him up Friday morning. I said, "This is not going to work." So he said, "What's the problem?" So we tried to figure out, because there was an electric car that opened the door, right? And I said, "I'm just going to be here in the evening just for, just to sleep. It's not a big deal." So we're trying to figure out how to slip something around the handle so that, it could keep it open. But then when I walked out, I saw that the whole lobby had another electric, and you really couldn't get in. I just ended up sleeping in someone else's apartment. So it's not, sometimes you can find solutions, sometimes you can't. It's good to keep it in mind. If you are going to a hotel, for example, you should ask the local rabbi where you're going. Send an email in advance. Say, "I'm coming to you. Do you have a Shabbat hotel?" Meaning that it doesn't mean that the hotel is kosher, meaning that there's manual keys, that you don't have these electric problems. It's a known problem. I can give you a list in Malmö, for example, where you could stay. Smaller hotels, family-based hotels, usually are older, and then they are many times either they can they don't have these automated systems, or they can also, you can talk to them about the problem before Shabbat. So when you walk in, they actually open the door for you or something like that. Yeah, we have a few more questions. Arad.
Okay, about the Shabbat elevator, you already answered. That was my question. But in Bnei Brak, they have, you're talking about noise, they have their own system of generators for Shabbat. And
Yeah,
this is not to use the Zionistic electricity in Shabbat. That's one thing. The second, we talked before about Goy of Shabbat. And in Bnei Brak, they have Goy of Shabbat that they use in Shabbat for emergency or for whatever. And you say that it's absolutely not allowed before. So these two questions, that it's the generator in Shabbat, that it's not supposed to be. And of course, if it will be some problem with it, somebody need to fix it in Shabbat. So how this is go together with people that they are over ultra-Orthodox?
Yeah, okay. Regarding the Goy of Shabbat, I refer you back in the recording. You can find the recording because Rav Yoav gave an entire shiur on that, and what is allowed and what is not allowed. And I think both he and I criticized a bit the situation as it is being used, and just for the fun of it, so to say. But you can, if you missed that shiur, you can go back and listen to it. And second is that regarding the question of electricity in Israel, then there's a big question, because you have many Jewish people who are working in the electrical companies, right, on Shabbat and violating the Shabbat. They're not doing it in a way that is necessary for the Shabbat. And they're not doing it in an indirect way. One thing I did not mention, we've mentioned it before in other shiurim, if you have to do something on the Shabbat, find an indirect way to do it. But they're not doing it in an indirect way. They're running the powerhouses as usual. The chief rabbinate in Israel relies on the fact that this electricity is necessary to run the country. Hospitals need this electricity. Babies need this electricity. Older people, elders need the electricity. So we rely on the fact that even if someone is doing it, he's doing it for them. And as we said, that would be permissible if necessary in certain cases. So there are those, as you mentioned, in some communities, like Haredi communities, that don't want to rely on this, and they have their own system. They have a generator that runs from before the Shabbat and provides electricity for their own buildings. It's just like, first of all, it's not a solution for everyone. Second of all, I think it makes a lot of noise. Third, it makes a lot of pollution. I don't think I think that the chief rabbis of Israel, at least for me, are big enough, have big enough shoulders to rely on, that we don't have to create other solutions, but there are those who want to create their own. So let them do so. But I think that it's that in itself, we want to create solutions that work for everyone. Okay, Monica and Kato, back to you.
I just want to mention that since today, many big brands makes ovens for the kitchens that comes with so-called Shabbat functions, but I am sure that they are not permitted according to the Tzommet Institute and the Orthodox tradition, that it's maybe more directed against the Reform Judaism or something, that so people are aware that there come solutions that say they are Shabbat, kosher for Shabbat, but they are really not for according to Orthodox direction.
Right. That's why I agree, and that's why it's very good that everyone in the shiur, you have your rabbi, which I stressed a few times, to ask, because to make sure that something is okay. Machon Tzomet, as you mentioned, that's it's really an institute which works around the clock to create solutions, especially for hospitals, but also for elders and for people who really need this, and also a platter that you buy has their signature on it. They're scientists that are rabbis that it's fun.
And they have some
Sorry?
They also have some security solutions. So
yes,
they are
and secure. Yeah, and a synagogue in Malmö, for example, was in touch with them because we say yes, we have security needs, but that doesn't mean we just do everything. We can find indirect ways to have electricity run, for example, so that we're not doing a direct melacha, and then if it's necessary and it is the Rabbanan and it's necessary for the security, for example, but we just don't say, oh, well, that is okay. We're way past our time. Maybe a last question from Elisa and Victor. Did we have anything? Okay, so obviously this raises a lot of questions. Lars, you wrote Theater Hotelet in Malmö uses only manual keys. That is correct. They also have a kosher menu, kosher, non-kosher menu. I don't know if you've seen that, Lars, that I put together there, saying, what you can eat from the buffet. So that's exactly what I meant, a family-based, that I as a rabbi could come to them and talk to them. It's not Scandic network, which is impossible, but to talk to them locally, they have their systems set throughout Scandinavia, whereas the family-based hotels are much better, and they're older. I'm going to be a weekend in Vienna in a month, so I know this family-based hotel, same thing. They have manual keys. I can call them up before and make sure that when I was in Oslo, I tried to even have this discussion. It was impossible. What do you mean? Electric, manual, it's like, that's not how it works. So I hope I have not confused you today. I hope that we understand that electricity creates challenges for us in the halachic world, a lot because it's not so clear definition of what we are actually violating, but it's obvious to us that what should be allowed and what should not be allowed, and I think that's the most important thing. And if you have specific cases of urgency or day-to-day challenges that with the light, for example, in the building or something like that, then you should talk to your rabbi about them. So we saw different ideas of the melachot. We saw we talked about different things which are allowed and not allowed with electricity on Shabbat. I wish you all Shavua Tov. May we have only good news and good tidings this week, and have a wonderful and healthy week. Lihitraot to you all.
Shabbat tov.
Shabbat tov. Thank you.
Shavua Tov.
שבוע טוב. תודה רבה.